I'm so sorry. Please don't send me back. I'll do anything to stay. No, but it's the first time I've laughed in 5 years.
They said the soul died in Wyatt Callahan, the winter of '73. For 5 years, the Wyoming wind was the only thing that howled louder than his grief, until a train from Philadelphia brought him a bride, a secret, and a disaster so spectacular it brought him back to life. The Wyoming Territory in 1878 was no place for a man with a hollow chest, yet Wyatt Callahan had carved a life out of the unforgiving earth at Broken Ridge Ranch. He was a man made of rawhide and silence. The locals in the nearby outpost of Laramie swore he hadn't spoken more than 3 consecutive sentences since the cholera outbreak took his wife, Mary, and their infant son 5 years prior. Wyatt didn't live. He merely existed, punishing himself with backbreaking labor beneath the sprawling, indifferent western sky. But a sprawling ranch could not be run by a ghost. Winter was approaching. The cattle needed tending, and the solitary confinement of the ranch house was beginning to manifest in a dangerous, gnawing exhaustion. Prompted by Sheriff Harlan Brooks, a friend who had watched Wyatt slowly deteriorate, Wyatt submitted a sterile, emotionless advertisement to the Matrimonial News based out of Kansas City. He didn't ask for love, nor did he ask for beauty. He asked for a sturdy woman of strong constitution who could cook, mend, and tolerate a quiet house. In exchange, he offered legal protection, a roof, and a widow's inheritance should the harsh frontier claim him. The reply came 3 weeks later, penned in a frantic slanted script by a Miss Josephine Miller of Philadelphia. Her letter was brief, agreeing to the terms with an almost desperate haste. Wyatt signed the proxy papers, sent the train fare, and pushed the matter to the back of his mind until the telegraph office confirmed her arrival on the westbound Union Pacific. When Wyatt stood on the dusty platform of the Laramie Depot, he looked like a statue chiseled from sandstone. The great black steam engine hissed and groaned to a halt, belching soot into the crisp autumn air. Passengers disembarked cattlemen, merchants, and soldiers. But Wyatt's eyes locked onto a figure that looked entirely out of place. Josephine Miller was not the sturdy, pragmatic pioneer woman he had envisioned. She stepped off the train wearing a traveling dress of deep plum velvet, entirely unsuited for the alkali dust of Wyoming. She was slight, with dark hair hastily pinned beneath an impractical feathered hat. She clutched a heavy carpet bag to her chest, as if it contained the gold reserves of the federal treasury. As Wyatt stepped forward to introduce himself, the Wyoming wind caught her hat. Josephine gasped, reached for it, and in doing so, her boot caught the edge of a splintered floorboard. It was a disaster in slow motion. Josephine pitched forward, her hands instinctively throwing out to break her fall. The overstuffed carpetbag hit the planks and burst violently open at the brass clasp. Instead of practical homespun woolens or cast-iron cooking implements, a chaotic array of items scattered across the platform, a shattered porcelain teacup, reams of delicate, useless lace, several crumpled dime novels, and, oddly, a heavy, leather-bound ledger with a brass lock that hit the wood with a heavy thud. Wyatt stopped in his tracks, staring down at the mess. Josephine scrambled to her knees, her face flushed a furious, brilliant crimson. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling as she frantically shoved the ledger deep into the bag before gathering the broken porcelain. "The floorboard I didn't see. I am Josephine. Miss Miller. I mean, Mrs. Callahan." Wyatt knelt slowly, his knees popping in the quiet morning air. He picked up a strip of delicate, mud-stained lace and handed it to her. His eyes were cold, assessing, and utterly devoid of warmth. "You don't look like you can hold a plow, Miss Miller." "I can learn," she blurted out, wiping a streak of soot from her cheek, which only managed to smear it further. "I assure you, Mr. Callahan, I am a very quick study. And I had to leave Philadelphia." Wyatt didn't ask why. The frontier was filled with people running from their pasts, and he was too consumed by his own ghosts to care about hers. He merely tipped his hat, gathered her ruined bag, and pointed toward the buckboard wagon. The 2-hour ride to Broken Ridge Ranch was conducted in excruciating silence. Wyatt drove the team of bays with practiced ease, staring straight ahead at the jagged horizon. Beside him, Josephine gripped the wooden seat until her knuckles turned white, her velvet dress absorbing the pervasive dust until it turned a dull, lifeless gray. She was terrified, not just of the vast, empty wilderness that threatened to swallow her whole, but of the silence of the man beside her. She had read the matrimonial contract. She knew she was expected to be a functional partner in a harsh environment. But as she looked at Wyatt's grim profile, she wondered if she had traded one nightmare in Philadelphia for a slower, quieter demise in Wyoming. She touched the side of her carpetbag, feeling the hard outline of the locked ledger. He cannot know, she thought frantically. If he finds out who I really am, he will send me back. And if I go back, Arthur will kill me. Wyatt pulled the wagon up to the weather-beaten ranch house. He tied off the reins and turned to her, his voice like grinding gravel. The kitchen is in the back. The stove needs wood. I'll be in the barn until sundown. It was not a welcome. It was a sentence. And as Josephine stepped down, immediately tripping over the hem of her ridiculous velvet dress and stumbling into the dirt, she realized her survival was going to require a miracle. The first week at Broken Ridge Ranch was a testament to human endurance, mostly Wyatt's. If Josephine Miller had ever seen a wood-burning stove in her life, it had been from the safe distance of a wealthy parlor, tended to by servants. Her initial attempt at making biscuits resulted in charred, rock-hard discs that Wyatt quietly fed to his hunting dog, who promptly buried them in the yard. Her attempt to boil laundry, using what she thought was soaproot, turned out to be crushed elderberries, dyeing Wyatt's only good set of long johns, a vibrant, horrifying shade of lavender. Through it all, Wyatt remained stoic, silently rectifying her mistakes after she had gone to sleep. He was a man dead inside. A little lavender undergarment was not enough to rouse his ire, but Josephine was deeply, painfully aware of her failures. She was trying so desperately hard to prove her worth, fueled by the terrifying knowledge that she had nowhere else to go. She replaced her velvet dress with a simple, albeit ill-fitting, calico gown she found in a trunk upstairs, Mary's old trunk. When Wyatt saw her wearing it, a muscle feathered in his jaw, but he simply turned on his heel and walked out into the pasture without a word. Josephine had wept for an hour by the cast-iron stove, convinced she was the most useless creature God had ever put on the earth. The breaking point arrived on a blistering Tuesday afternoon. Wyatt was in the corral, attempting to rope a stubborn, half-feral calf that had broken away from the main herd. The calf was a menace, kicking up dust and dodging Wyatt's lariat with infuriating agility. The sun was beating down. Sweat was stinging Wyatt's eyes, and his patience, usually an endless reservoir of apathy, was beginning to thin. Josephine, watching from the porch and desperate to finally be of some use, decided this was her moment. She grabbed a wooden bucket of sweet feed, intending to lure the calf, and marched toward the corral. To shield herself from the blazing sun, she had popped open a delicate, lace-trimmed parasol she had salvaged from her carpetbag. "Miss Miller, stay back," Wyatt barked, his voice cracking like a whip. It was the loudest she had heard him speak since her arrival. "I can help. I have oats," Josephine called back, stepping into the muddy enclosure. The calf, already panicked by the rope, took one look at the approaching woman wielding a brightly colored, spinning parasol and lost its bovine mind. It bolted directly toward her. "Look out!" Wyatt lunged forward, but he was too late. Josephine shrieked. She tried to step back, but her boot sank deep into a patch of thick, slick manure and mud. She flailed wildly, the parasol flying into the air. In a desperate bid to keep her balance, she reached out and grabbed the edge of a large wooden trough filled with a mixture of molasses and grain meant for the draft horses. Gravity and physics conspired against her in the most spectacular fashion. Josephine pulled the heavy trough directly onto herself. She went down hard in the mud, the wooden trough tipping over and dumping 3 gallons of thick, sticky molasses and loose oats entirely over her head and shoulders. The frightened calf, suddenly smelling the sweet feed, skidded to a halt. Instead of trampling her, the animal leaned down and began enthusiastically licking the molasses directly off Josephine's face. Wyatt froze. The lariat slipped from his gloved hands. He stood in the center of the corral, staring at the scene before him. Josephine sat up slowly. She was unrecognizable. Her calico dress was plastered to her body with brown mud and black syrup. Oats were stuck in her hair, clumping together like grotesque ornaments. The calf continued to aggressively lick her ear. She looked up at Wyatt, her eyes wide and shining with unshed tears through a mask of sticky dirt. Her chest heaved. The humiliation was absolute. The fear was paralyzing. She knew it was over. No man would keep a bride this disastrous. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. The tears finally spilled over, cutting clean tracks through the molasses on her cheeks. "I'm so sorry. Mr. Callahan, I'm useless. I am entirely useless. Please don't send me back. I'll sleep in the barn. I won't eat. Just please don't send me back to Philadelphia." She buried her face in her sticky hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the mud. Wyatt stared at the trembling, sobbing, oat-covered woman. He looked at the calf, which was now happily chewing on the lace trim of her discarded parasol. He looked back at Josephine. Something deep within his chest, a heavy iron vault that had been sealed shut for 5 long years, suddenly cracked. A strange, unfamiliar pressure built up in his throat. His shoulders began to shake. Josephine, hearing the sound, peeked through her fingers, terrified he was furious. But Wyatt Callahan wasn't angry. He threw his head back, and a sound erupted from him. It started as a low, rusty rumble, scraping against vocal cords that hadn't used the frequency in half a decade. Then it broke free. It was a loud, booming, chest-deep laugh. It echoed off the barn, startling the horses. It was genuine, unbridled, and completely out of his control. He couldn't stop. He laughed until his eyes watered, clutching his stomach, pointing at the calf that was now wearing the parasol like a bizarre hat. Josephine sat in the mud, utterly stunned. The fearsome, grieving cowboy was laughing. And as she watched the harsh lines of his face soften, shedding years of sorrow in the span of a single, joyous outburst, she realized something profound. He was fiercely, devastatingly handsome when he smiled. Slowly, tentatively, a giggle bubbled up through her own sobs. She looked down at herself, covered in syrup and oats, and the absurdity of it all finally hit her. She started to laugh, too. There they were, the broken widower and the disastrous bride, laughing together in the muck of the corral. For the first time since '73, Wyatt stepped forward, not with a scowl, but with a gentle hand extended to pull his muddy wife to her feet. But joy on the frontier is a fragile thing. 20 miles away, back in the dusty town of Laramie, the afternoon stagecoach rolled to a halt outside the sheriff's office. A man stepped down. He did not wear denim or canvas, but a sharply tailored charcoal suit and a bowler hat. His eyes were cold, calculating, and fixed like a predator's. He walked into the office, his polished shoes clicking ominously against the floorboards. Sheriff Harlan Brooks looked up from his ledger. "Can I help you, mister?" Harlan asked, eyeing the stranger's expensive clothes. The man reached into his breast pocket and produced a crumpled, hand-drawn sketch, laying it flat on the sheriff's desk. It was a remarkably accurate portrait of Josephine. "I believe you can, Sheriff," the man said, his voice smooth and dripping with Eastern money. "My name is Arthur Pendleton. I am looking for my fiancée. She stole a great deal of money from my family's estate, along with a rather sensitive ledger. I have reason to believe she fled west under a false name." Harlan frowned, looking at the sketch, a creeping sense of dread settling in his gut as he recognized the wide eyes of Wyatt Callahan's new mail-order bride. The molasses incident at the corral fundamentally shifted the axis of Broken Ridge Ranch. The oppressive, suffocating silence that had choked the homestead for 5 years vanished, replaced by a tentative, fragile warmth. Wyatt Callahan did not suddenly become a loquacious man, but the grim set of his jaw softened. When Josephine burned the bacon the following morning, he did not walk out. He simply scraped the char off with his hunting knife and handed her a piece with a quiet, knowing smirk. For Josephine, the laughter had been a baptism. She stopped trying to be the perfect, invisible pioneer wife and started allowing herself to learn. Wyatt, to her profound shock, became a patient teacher. He showed her how to properly bank the stove so the fire wouldn't die in the night, how to identify wild sage and prairie turnips, and, most importantly, how to hold the heavy Winchester rifle that hung over the mantel. "You don't pull the trigger, Josie," Wyatt murmured one evening, standing close behind her on the porch as she aimed at a tin can on a fence post. His large, calloused hands gently adjusted her grip, sending a sudden, electric jolt up her arms that had nothing to do with the Wyoming chill. "You squeeze it, like you're holding a fragile bird." She squeezed, the rifle bucked, the sound cracking across the valley, and the tin can went spinning into the sagebrush. Wyatt chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made Josephine's heart flutter against her ribs. She was changing. The terrified, clumsy girl from Philadelphia was shedding her velvet skin, reborn in calico and canvas. But every night, when the oil lamp was extinguished, the shadow of her past crept back into the room. The heavy carpetbag sat at the foot of her bed, the brass lock of the ledger gleaming menacingly in the moonlight. She knew she was living on borrowed time. That time ran out on a Thursday afternoon. Sheriff Harlan Brooks rode into the ranch yard, his horse lathered in sweat. Wyatt emerged from the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his eyes narrowing at the sheriff's urgent pace. Josephine, who had been pinning laundry to the line, froze. Harlan dismounted, his face grim under the brim of his Stetson. "Wyatt, Miss Josephine." He touched the brim of his hat, but his eyes were laced with sorrow. "We have a situation. A man rode into Laramie on the afternoon stage, wears a fancy Eastern suit, calls himself Arthur Pendleton." The wooden clothespin snapped in Josephine's fingers. All the color drained from her face. "He says he's looking for his runaway fiancée," Harlan continued, watching her closely. "Claims she stole a fortune from his family estate, along with some important business records. He hired 3 rough-looking deputies from the Territorial Marshal's office, guns for hire, mostly, and they're asking for directions to Broken Ridge." Wyatt turned slowly, his gaze pinning Josephine to the spot. The warmth that had been building in his eyes over the past week vanished, replaced by the cold, assessing stare of a man who realized he had let a viper into his home. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Josephine trembled, dropping the wet shirt she was holding into the dust. "He is not my fiancé," she whispered, her voice shaking violently. "And I am not a thief." "Then what are you, Josie?" Wyatt demanded, stepping toward her. Tears prickled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She was done running. "I am a witness," she said, her voice finding a sudden, desperate strength. She turned, ran into the house, and returned a moment later lugging the heavy ledger. She slammed it down on the porch railing and picked up Wyatt's hunting knife from a nearby table. With a sharp, violent thrust, she jammed the blade under the brass lock and pried. The metal groaned and snapped. She threw the book open. "My father was an accountant for the Union Pacific Railroad back east. He discovered a massive discrepancy in the government subsidies." She pointed a trembling finger at the columns of numbers. "Arthur Pendleton isn't just a wealthy socialite. He's a bagman for Thomas C. Durant and the Credit Mobilier Ring. They've been embezzling millions of dollars of federal railroad funds. Real, private money belonging to the government, laundered right under the nose of Congress." Harlan stepped onto the porch, his eyes widening as he looked at the meticulous bookkeeping. The Credit Mobilier scandal was a rumor that had shaken the entire country, reaching all the way to the vice president's office. If this ledger was real, it was a death warrant. "My father was going to take this to the Pinkerton Detective Agency." Josephine's voice cracked. "Arthur found out. He pushed my father out of a 4th-story window. The police called it a suicide, but I was there. I was hiding in the study. I took the ledger and ran." She looked up at Wyatt, her heart breaking at the stern line of his jaw. "Arthur claimed we were engaged to the press so he could use the law to hunt me down as a runaway thief. If he gets this book, he walks free, and he will kill me to get it." Wyatt stared at the open ledger, then up at the terrified woman who had dumped molasses on her head, who burned biscuits, and who had somehow managed to restart his dead heart. He saw the fire in her eyes, the sheer underdog grit of a woman who had crossed an entire continent to hold corrupt men accountable. Wyatt reached out, closing the ledger with a solid thud. He handed it to Harlan. "Sheriff, I believe this is federal evidence. You ought to hold on to it." Harlan nodded slowly, tucking the book under his arm. "I'll wire the U.S. Marshals out of Cheyenne. But Wyatt, Arthur and those hired guns are less than an hour behind me. Wyatt turned his head, spitting into the dust. He reached up and took his rifle down from the porch rack, checking the chamber with a smooth, metallic clack. "Let them come," Wyatt said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They're not in Philadelphia anymore." The Wyoming sun began its descent, casting long, bloody shadows across the plains. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons, carrying the distant, rhythmic thud of approaching hooves. Wyatt had positioned Harlan inside the barn with a clear line of sight to the yard, holding the ledger securely. Josephine, despite her protests, had been ordered inside the house. But as she watched Wyatt stand alone on the porch, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving landscape, she realized she could not cower in the dark. She grabbed a Colt revolver from the bedside table, one Wyatt had showed her how to load 2 days prior, and crept out to the side window, cracking the shutters just enough to aim. 4 riders broke over the ridge. Arthur Pendleton rode at the front, looking utterly absurd and severely out of place in a dusty wool suit and bowler hat. Beside him rode 3 hardened frontiersmen, their hands resting lazily on the holsters of their 6-shooters. They pulled their horses to a halt, 20 yards from the porch. Arthur sneered, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket to wipe the alkaline dust from his face. "Mr. Callahan, I presume," Arthur called out, his voice carrying the arrogant, nasal drawl of Eastern high society. "You're trespassing," Wyatt replied, his voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. He stood perfectly still, his rifle held loosely in his right hand. "I have no quarrel with you, rancher," Arthur said smoothly. "I have come to collect my wayward bride and the property she stole from me. Hand her over, and I'll compensate you for your troubles. I imagine a man in your meager position could use a few gold eagles." "My wife isn't for sale," Wyatt stated flatly, "and she doesn't belong to you." Arthur's smile vanished, his eyes turning cold and reptilian. "You misunderstand the situation, cowboy. You are a single dirt farmer, standing against 4 armed men. I am taking Josephine back to Pennsylvania, and I am taking my ledger. If I have to burn this miserable shack to the ground to do it, I will." He gestured to his hired guns. "Take him." The 3 men moved to draw their weapons, but they severely underestimated the man they were facing. The frontier had forged Wyatt Callahan in fire and ice. Before the first hired gun could even clear leather, Wyatt's rifle was at his shoulder. Crack. The man's hat flew off his head. A neat hole punched straight through the crown, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. The man froze in sheer terror. "Next one goes between the eyes," Wyatt promised, his finger tight on the trigger. "Shoot him, you fools!" Arthur shrieked, kicking his horse forward and reaching inside his suit coat for a hidden derringer. From the side window of the house, a shot rang out. The bullet shattered the dirt right at the hooves of Arthur's horse. The animal reared back wildly, pitching Arthur backward. He tumbled out of the saddle, landing hard in the Wyoming dirt, his bowler hat rolling away into the sagebrush. Josephine stepped out onto the porch, her hands gripping the Colt firmly, smoke still curling from the barrel. She stood shoulder to shoulder with Wyatt, her chin held high. The helpless, clumsy girl was gone, replaced by a fierce woman defending her home. "I'm not going back, Arthur," Josephine said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "And you aren't getting your book. It's over." Before Arthur could scramble to his feet, the heavy doors of the barn swung open. Sheriff Harlan Brooks stepped out, a double-barreled shotgun leveled at the hired men. "Drop 'em, boys," Harlan commanded, "unless you want to explain to the federal judge in Cheyenne why you were aiding a known embezzler and murderer." The hired guns, realizing they were outgunned and caught in a federal dispute that paid far too little for a shallow grave, slowly raised their hands and tossed their revolvers into the dirt. Arthur sat in the mud, his expensive suit ruined, staring in disbelief at the formidable wall of opposition. The power he wielded in the gilded halls of the East meant absolutely nothing in the brutal, honest light of the West. He was utterly defeated by a grieving rancher and a woman he had underestimated. Harlan marched forward, hauling Arthur to his feet and snapping a heavy pair of iron cuffs around his wrists. "Arthur Pendleton, you're under arrest by order of the territorial law, pending federal charges regarding the credit mobilier ledger. You're going to hang, you son of a bitch." As Harlan loaded the prisoners onto their horses for the long trek back to the Laramie jail, the silence returned to Broken Ridge Ranch. But this time, it was not the silence of a graveyard. It was the peaceful quiet of a storm that had finally passed. Wyatt lowered his rifle. He turned to Josephine, looking at the gun still clutched in her hands, and then up to her face, which was smudged with gunpowder and dirt. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "You missed," he teased softly. Josephine smiled back, her heart soaring as she looked at her husband. "I was aiming for the horse's hooves. I didn't want to ruin a perfectly good saddle." Wyatt stepped closer, reaching out to gently take the revolver from her hands. He set it on the railing, then wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest. For the first time in 5 years, Wyatt Callahan had something worth living for. Josephine buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine, leather, and home. The ghosts of the past were finally laid to rest, and in the heart of the Wild West, 2 broken souls had found their rebirth in each other. The frontier tested them, but Wyatt and Josie proved that even the deepest grief can be healed by a second chance at life. What did you think of that explosive showdown? If this Wild West redemption story kept you hooked, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming dramatic frontier tales. Leave a comment below. Would you survive a Wyoming winter?